Hey everyone, hope you're all doing well. I'm out here in western North Carolina just photographing some waterfalls this morning. I've had a really nice time. The light was great this morning. There was a little bit of cloud cover, so it was kind of diffused as it was coming through, and it was just a really nice time. And it's about lunchtime now. The light's a little bit harsh, while I was having lunch, I was kind of thinking about the lessons I've learned in shooting waterfalls. And I wrote some of my thoughts down in my notebook, and I wanted to share them with you in hopes that they would help you improve your waterfall photography. So let's get to it.
I watch you as you drive. Do you know I'm looking? And I can't help but smile. Do you know how much I love you? You put my favorite song on, I put my feet up, and we just sing along. And I can't help but feeling, just loving this moment. Can we stay here forever?
So this morning when I was out photographing a few waterfalls, I actually made kind of an on-location video talking about composition and just kind of my whole process. So if you haven't watched that yet, I'll link it somewhere and you can go check it out now. So my tip number one kind of for waterfall photography, and one of the more important tips I think, is the ability to understand and control your shutter speed. Photographing waterfalls to me is one of the more artistic kind of forms of landscape photography, because you can do a lot to change the outcome of your image. And a lot of that has to do with shutter speed. You can change the look of your water, you can change how your trees look, how your foliage looks. And that does a lot to, two people can take the same composition and it will look totally different. And that has a lot to do with shutter speed. So I think one of the more popular things to do with waterfalls is to create that milky, smooth waterfall. And that requires a slow shutter speed. And a slow shutter speed requires a tripod, because you need everything to be steady. With a slower shutter speed, you're not going to be able to hand hold and get everything sharp with the water smooth. So a sturdy tripod is a must for sure. And I think with that being one of the more popular looks, that milky water, there's a tendency for some people to get out there and throw a 10-stop ND filter on the front of their lens and blur everything out for 30 seconds. And sometimes that might look great, but I hesitate to do that, and I rarely do that. I think the use of your shutter speed needs to portray kind of the emotion and the feeling you're trying to go for with that image, because shutter speed can do a lot to blur out water or create a lot of texture in the water. A smoother, longer shutter speed where your water is very smooth is going to do a lot to create a very calm, serene image. But if I'm taking a picture of a massive raging waterfall, I might not want that to feel calm. I might want you to feel the intensity of that waterfall. So shutter speed can do a lot to change all that, really. And understanding what a fast shutter speed and what a slow shutter speed can do to the texture of water is crucial. And kind of another side of controlling your shutter speed and coming back to a tripod is that sometimes you might want that water to be smooth with a slow shutter speed, but you want those leaves and those trees and everything to be tack sharp. And that's really, really difficult with a slow shutter speed if there's any sort of breeze. So sometimes you might have to blend two exposures together. You're going to take the water from one image and kind of the foliage and the surrounding area from another image. And I've done that a lot. It's a great look, I think. But in order to do that, you have to take the exact same image twice or the exact same composition twice. And that requires a tripod. You can't bump it, you can't move your camera at all. It has to be perfectly still. So those are really the two aspects of understanding and controlling your shutter speed with waterfall photography for me. And they're both critical, I think, in creating a satisfying and creative waterfall image. So my tip number two for waterfall photography has to do with light conditions. And I think it's a given when we talk about landscape photography that the light is not always perfect. A lot of the times you have to come back to a location 5, 10, 15 times before you get those conditions that you're looking for. And This morning I was pretty fortunate. There's a lot of cloud cover, a lot of diffused light, and I was pretty much able to pick the shutter speed that I wanted. But a lot of the times that's not what you're going to get. Right now the light is fairly harsh. I'm kind of in this river gorge and it's a little bit shady, but every now and then the light kind of pokes through. And if you could imagine that on a waterfall, that would be difficult. So really what I'm talking about in terms of harsh light is that water is a very reflective surface, and you can do a little to combat that in terms of filters and things like that, but you can't cut it out completely. And especially white water. There's a lot of glare in white water. So when you have really bright light shining right on that waterfall, you get a lot of glare. And it's very difficult to create an image that has a lot of that glare or hot spots kind of scattered throughout the waterfall. It ends up looking kind of blotchy, and you can do your best to kind of underexpose and keep your highlights from being blown out, but then you run the risk of losing your shadows, and you can create some sort of HDR kind of looking image. I don't think it's a great look. It's possible, but the better image will always come from better light conditions. And I think it's important to understand that. I'm not saying don't go shoot if it's sunny out. That's not at all. I think it's important to be able to shoot in different conditions, but at the same time know that your best conditions are probably when it's a little overcast or maybe when there's a little fog. I think that can do a lot to add to your waterfall photograph. So lighting, you know, if we circle back to tip number 1 in controlling your shutter, lighting's going to do a lot for what you can do with your shutter speed, depending on what sort of ND filters you have and that kind of thing. But your shutter speed will be largely dependent on what light do I have available and how much light do I have available. So just keep in mind, light conditions are going to make or break your waterfall photography. Tip number 3, get your feet wet. I think all too often people come photograph rivers and waterfalls and they stand on the banks, keep their feet dry, take a few pictures, get the best they can and leave. And you're really limiting your creative opportunities if you just stay on the banks. Oftentimes the best compositions are out in the middle of the water. And if you're not willing to get your feet wet, you can't get those compositions. So it's a simple tip. Bring some extra shoes, wear rubber boots, wear waders. I'm just in kind of trail running shoes. Luckily we're in North Carolina, the water's not too cold. But get your feet wet. And kind of a little caveat to getting your feet wet. Be respectful of the river though. Don't move the rocks, tread lightly. A lot of animals do make this their home, and we don't want to disturb that. We don't want to destroy any ecosystem. So tread lightly, but get your feet wet. It'll dramatically improve your photography. Waterfall tip number 4, use a circular polarizer. A circular polarizer is a filter that's going to go on the front of your lens, and you're going to be able to turn it and adjust the amount of polarization. When you start to shoot a lot of waterfalls, you'll notice there are some surfaces that are really reflective. Water is very reflective, wet rock or rock in general is really reflective, and leaves are actually extremely reflective surfaces. And a lot of the times those reflective surfaces can really take away from a photograph. They draw a lot of attention, they might be really bright, and that's not always a good thing. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. So a lot of the times in shooting waterfalls, I find myself using a circular polarizer to cut out those reflections, and that really improves my image. This morning I recorded a quick clip of me kind of turning the polarizer on the front of my lens so you can see the difference between reflection and no reflection, and I'll show that now. There's with it off, you can kind of see the glare up on the rocks here and on the logs. See, it makes a big difference. But I'll turn it back, and we should get, there we go. My 5th and final waterfall tip has to do with composition. And if you go watch that other video that I talked about, I've linked it. I go way more in depth about composition, and you'll actually get an example of me composing a few images. But in general, I think there's a tendency when shooting waterfalls to fill the frame with the waterfall. And sometimes that's great, but sometimes, and oftentimes, I think that's not really the most creative, unique, satisfying shot you can get. So it's important, I think, to use the leading lines, the stream, the foliage, everything around the waterfall in your composition. And that'll vary vastly depending on the waterfall and what's around it. But just don't get stuck in the rut of, here's the waterfall, I'm filling my frame with this waterfall. Be creative, use what's around it.
How much I love you. You put my favorite song on, I put my feet up, and we just sing along. And I can't help but feeling, just loving this moment. Can we stay here forever? I'm loving this moment. Can we stay here together? If I could stop the time, don't you know that
Now, I don't claim to be the world expert in waterfall photography, that is for sure, but I do really enjoy it, and I think that I've picked up a trick or two in my time in shooting waterfalls. So hopefully you found these 5 tips helpful. I think they can really help improve your waterfall photography. And if you did find them helpful, if you could consider hitting that like button and that subscribe button, that would really help me out. But as always, I really appreciate you taking the time to watch this video, and I'll see you all again soon. Bye.
just loving this moment. Can we stay here